She was the last mail-order bride no one wanted. Returned 3 times. Shipped west like something left over. But the man waiting at that Nevada train platform had no idea he wasn't just getting a wife. He was getting the one woman who could bring down the most dangerous man in the county, the same man who had murdered her father 6 years ago, and neither of them knew it yet. This story reminds us that the people life seems to overlook are sometimes exactly where they are supposed to be, waiting for the one person who will finally see them clearly. Welcome to this channel, where every story we tell lives in the dust and silence of the American West. Stories of cowboys and the women who matched them, of love found in hard country, of mothers who held families together through drought and danger, of strangers who became everything to each other, and of the simple human truth that kindness and courage are the most powerful things a person can carry. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or gave you something you needed today, hit that like button, leave a comment, telling us what you felt. Share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe so you never miss the next story we bring to life for you.
The Denver Marriage Bureau sent her with a handwritten note, paperclipped to the corner of her file. It said, "This one has been returned 3 times, you sure?" Cole Merritt read it twice, walked to the stove, and burned the note. He kept the photograph. He told himself it was practical. A man ought to know what his intended looks like. He told himself that for 11 days, right up until the afternoon train pulled into Silver Creek, and he found himself standing at the platform with his hat in his hands for the first time since his mother's funeral. Silver Creek, Nevada, September 1878. The town sat at 4,800 feet in the basin country, where the air smelled of red dust and juniper smoke and the faint chemical bite of mercury drifting down from the stamp mill on the eastern ridge. That mill ran day and night. Its rhythmic crushing of ore-bearing rock had become the town's heartbeat, and everyone in Silver Creek had learned to sleep through it. When it stopped, people woke up. When it stopped for more than a day, people started selling. 5 women stepped off the afternoon train. Cole watched from the far end of the platform with his hat low and his arms crossed, the way a man stands when he is calculating whether he can still leave before being seen. 4 men were waiting near the depot doors, hats held, boots recently cleaned, faces caught somewhere between hope and terror. The reunions happened quickly, the way these things did when 2 strangers had been writing letters for 3 months and had finally run out of paper to hide behind. The 5th woman was the last one off the car. She stepped onto the platform and found no one waiting. She stood there in a navy traveling dress that had been worn for 3 days, carrying a leather satchel that held everything she owned, and she looked around the platform with the calm, systematic assessment of a woman who had spent years learning quickly and under pressure which situations were survivable and which ones were not. Cole pushed off the wall and crossed to her. She turned before he reached her. She had heard his boots on the platform boards before she saw him, and she had already decided something about him based on the sound of how he walked, which was the kind of thing battlefield nurses learned to do when they spent 2 years telling wounded men apart by the sound of their breathing. Cole said, "Miss Calloway." She said, "You are late." He said, "Horse through a shoe on the Ridge Road. I walked the last mile." She looked at his boots. Dusty, but not trail-worn enough for a mile. She looked back up at him. She said, "Which horse?" "A beat." Something very small changed in Cole Merritt's expression. The kind of change that happens when a man realizes he has been caught in a test he did not know he was taking. He said, "The gray." She has been favoring that left rear for a week. I should have checked before I left. He had said something true. This registered. She said, "All right. Where is the wagon?" That was their entire introduction, and it established everything. She was observant and direct. She tested people with small, verifiable claims. And Cole Merritt passed the test without knowing he was being tested, which was the only kind of passing that meant anything. They rode for 40 minutes on a high desert road that wound through sagebrush flats and up into Pinon pine country. Cole watched the road. Nora Calloway watched the land. She noticed the grazing land around them was mostly unfenced. She noticed two abandoned homesteads within a mile of each other, recent enough that the window glass was still intact. She noticed the creek running alongside the road had an odd color where it widened into a flat, and the grass along its bank was yellowed and thin. She did not ask about any of this yet. The ranch appeared after the last rise, sitting low against the hillside in the particular Nevada way of things built to last rather than to impress. The house was timber and stone, single-story, sound roof. A barn that leaned slightly east. Corrals holding 8 horses, all of them well kept in a way the house was not. Nora saw the horses first, then the barn, then the house. The order told her something about the man sitting beside her. Cole showed her the second bedroom. It was prepared and clean with a pitcher of water on the dresser and a window that looked out over the grazing land toward the mountains. He said the house has 2 bedrooms. This one is yours until we decide how to proceed. I am not going to rush anything. If you need time to determine whether this arrangement suits you, I would rather know that now than later. Nora looked at him for a moment. She said, what I need to know is whether you meant what you wrote in your letter. That you want a partner on this land, not a housekeeper who also cooks. Cole said, I meant it. She said, then I will tell you in 2 weeks whether this suits me. Is that acceptable? He said, that is more than fair. He left and closed the door quietly behind him. She unpacked her satchel. Her father's pistol. His last letter. A single spent cartridge she carried in her coat pocket, the last thing she had picked up off the floor of her father's forge in Callaway County, Missouri, 6 years ago, and 3,000 miles from here. 3 dresses, a medical kit. A geology primer her father had given her the year before he died, because she kept asking questions about what was underneath the ground they stood on. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of uncertainty. Then she went to make supper. The meal was simple. Salt pork and beans and biscuits that came out better than Cole expected. He ate without excessive comment, which she appreciated. He refilled her coffee without being asked, which she appreciated more. After supper, they sat for a few minutes in the main room and discussed practical matters in the practical way of 2 people who understood that what they were really discussing was whether they could tolerate each other long enough to find out if they could do more than tolerate each other. That night, past midnight, a sound at the gate. Cole was already up. He slept light, the way men do who have spent years waiting for consequences to arrive. Nora was at the kitchen doorway when he came back inside. He did not speak immediately. He just stood in the doorway with a lantern, and she looked past him to the gate post, where a horse stood with its head down, a rope loose around its neck, and a strip of red cloth tied below its mane. The horse was wounded. A shallow cut along its flank, crusted and not fresh, placed with the particular precision of someone who understood exactly how much damage to cause. Nora said, that is a warning. It was not a question. Cole's jaw was tight. He said yes. She said, who from? He looked at her for a long moment as if calculating what she could handle. She held his gaze with the flat patience of a woman who had been underestimated before and found it tiresome. He said, I do not know yet, which was true mostly. He had suspicions he would not name until he was certain. He was, above all else, a man who had learned the cost of certainty arrived at too quickly. Cole carried the lantern toward the barn to get the horse settled. Nora walked to the gate post and crouched in the dirt. She lifted the horse's left rear hoof with the competence of someone who had grown up around a blacksmith's forge. She looked at the shoe. She ran her thumb over the maker's mark stamped into the iron, a small cross inside a circle, clean and precise. Not a Silver Creek mark. She had seen that mark before, in a different life, on a different piece of iron, in a different state. She straightened. She said nothing. She followed Cole to the barn. The following morning, Cole took Nora into town. Silver Creek on a Tuesday was 4 blocks of ambition that had never quite delivered, running along Main Street from the depot on the south end to the assay office on the north. The stamp mill on the eastern ridge sent its percussion down through the rock and into the soles of your boots if you stood still long enough. Red dust on every horizontal surface, the smell of mercury and horse and wood smoke layered in the still air. A functioning town with the slightly desperate energy of one that knows the mines are thinning and has not yet decided what comes next. Cole introduced Nora to the town with the minimum necessary social performance. She observed everything. At the public well on the north end of Main Street, she stopped and drew up a small amount of water. The water was clear but carried a faint mineral smell that was not right for this elevation. She had smelled it before, in field hospitals in Missouri, when certain compounds were used for cleaning surgical instruments. She dipped 2 fingers in, rubbed them together, touched her fingertip to her tongue. A faint metallic bitterness, thin but there. She wiped her hand on her skirt and said nothing. In the general store, 2 ranchers in the far corner were speaking quietly, their heads close together. They stopped when Cole and Nora came through the door. One of them gave Cole a long look that contained something Nora could not fully read yet. Warning or apology, or both. Harlan Cross came in while they were at the counter. He appeared to be exactly what a generous patron of a struggling town should look like. Well-dressed, without ostentation. A warm handshake for Cole and a warm smile for Nora, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years making people feel that meeting him was the best thing that had happened to them all week. He offered Nora a small jar of preserved peaches from a batch his housekeeper had made. "Welcome to Silver Creek," he said. "Or almost Mrs. Merritt, I suppose." He asked her thoughtful questions about the journey from Denver. He mentioned he had been to Denver once himself and found it promising. His hands were soft. She noticed this. A man his age who had built what he claimed to have built by his own labor should not have hands that soft. She filed this away beside the metallic taste from the well, and the looks from the ranchers, and the particular way Cole's shoulders had changed the moment Cross walked through the door. When Cross had gone, Cole said quietly, "That was Harlan Cross. He owns the Consolidated Silver operation east of town, most powerful man in the county." Nora said, "What does he want with your land?" Cole looked at her. He said, "What makes you think he wants my land?" She said he looked at you the way a man looks at something he has already decided he is going to have. I have seen that look before. Cole said nothing, but he did not deny it either. At the boarding house, Eleanor Marsh poured tea and asked careful questions. She was 62 years old, a widow, with the kind of careful competence that comes from managing difficult situations over a long period of time. When Nora mentioned she had grown up partly in Missouri, Eleanor's hand paused above the teapot. A very small hesitation, quick enough that most people would not have caught it. Nora caught it. She filed it away. That evening, Deputy Wade Harmon came to the ranch. He was 31, lean and sun-dark, with the watchful economy of movement of a man who spent his days paying attention to other people. He was the kind of person who seemed genuinely glad to see Cole, and Cole seemed genuinely glad to see him, and Nora noted this because Cole was not a man who expressed gladness easily. Nora was in the kitchen. The window was open. Cole and Wade spoke on the porch in low voices. She heard Wade say 3 more ranches signed over to Cross's land company this week. Ezra Dowd's probably next. His cattle are dropping fast. "Cole, Cross asked me about the woman you brought in. Asked specifically whether she had family somewhere who would come looking if..." A pause. Cole said, "If what?" Wade said quieter, "Just be careful is all I am saying." Nora set down the bread she was slicing. She looked at the window. She looked at the spent cartridge she had placed on the kitchen windowsill, her father's cartridge from his forge, the last thing she had picked up off the floor before she left Missouri. Be careful, she thought. I have been careful for 6 years. Careful and quiet and 1,000 miles from the man who killed my father. And here he is anyway. She picked up the bread knife and went back to work. 10 days after Nora Calloway arrived at the Merritt Ranch, the 2 of them were learning to share space in the way of people who have been careful for a long time and are not yet ready to be less careful, but have begun to understand that carefulness has its own costs. The morning rhythm established itself without discussion. Nora was up before Cole. She made coffee strong enough that the first morning he drank it without expression, and she watched him waiting for a reaction. He drank the second cup the same way. On the third morning, he made a small sound of something like appreciation that he probably had not intended to make out loud. She counted this as the first voluntary thing he had given her. Cole taught her the horses. He did it the way a craftsman explains a trade to someone he suspects might be good at it, which is differently from how you teach someone you think will never get it. He was right about her. She had her father's hands. A blacksmith's daughter carries a particular instinct for what an animal is feeling through its muscle and posture, something about reading weight and tension, and the way a living creature distributes its discomfort. Within a week, she could read Cole's horses better than some men who had been working with horses their whole lives. She reorganized the ranch's medical supplies, which amounted to a half-empty bottle of carbolic acid, bandaging that had been rolled and re-rolled until it was more lint than cloth, and a bottle of whiskey with a paper label that said for wounds, the label written in a hand that was probably Cole's. The bottle had been opened. She cataloged what they needed and wrote it out on a piece of paper and left it on the kitchen table without comment. The next time Cole was in town, he came back with everything on the list. He did not mention it. She noted this. One evening, he found her at the kitchen table with her father's geology primer, the pages marked up in 3 different colors of pencil. Her notes in the margins so small and dense they looked like a separate text running alongside the original. He picked up the book, looked at the title, looked at her. She said, "My father taught me to read land. He said, if you understand what is underneath, you understand why men do what they do above it." Cole set the book down and sat across from her. He said, "What do you see underneath Silver Creek?" She looked at him, checking whether this was a genuine question or a polite one. It was genuine. She said silver ore does not run in single veins. It runs in systems. If there is production on the eastern ridge, there is almost certainly continuation running southwest under the lower elevation ranches. The ones Cross has been buying. A long silence in the kitchen. Outside, the stamp mill sent its low percussion down through the mountain and through the floor and up through the legs of the chairs. Cole said your father was a blacksmith. She said my father was a blacksmith who refused to sell his land to a mining consortium that did not want to explain what was underneath it. 6 weeks later, he was dead. This was the first time she had said this directly to Cole. He received it with the stillness of a man who recognizes the weight of a thing being put down after a long carrying. He said, "I am sorry about your father." She said, "I know you are." She picked up her book. "That is why I said it to you instead of keeping it to myself." Cole had been watching her practice with her father's pistol. She was accurate but deliberate, with too much thinking between the decision and the action. In a situation where a decision needed to be made fast, deliberate got you killed. He offered to work with her on speed. The lesson required physical closeness, adjusting her stance and her grip and the angle of her shoulder. Neither of them acknowledged this. They focused entirely on the mechanics. But when they broke and Cole stepped back, there was a moment where neither of them moved immediately, and the particular quality of that stillness was its own kind of conversation. She said you were a detective. He said Pinkerton. Past tense. She said why past tense. He looked at the fence post he had nailed the target to. He said I was wrong about someone once, the kind of wrong you cannot undo. She looked at him for a moment. She said I was right about someone once, the kind of right no one believed. They looked at each other across 10 feet of Nevada afternoon. Cole said, "We make a pair." It was not a romantic statement, it was a recognition. The kind that sometimes matters more than the romantic kind. That night after supper, after Nora had gone to her room and he was sitting alone at the table with a lamp and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, a letter arrived with the last of the evening's mail delivery. It had been rerouted twice and was 3 weeks old. It was from George Aldis, a former colleague from the Pinkerton years, one of the few men from that life Cole still trusted enough to believe when they said something was important. Aldis wrote carefully, the way men write when they suspect the mail is not entirely private. He wrote Cole, "I have been working a land fraud case out of Missouri. The man at the center of it worked under at least 4 names between 1868 and 1875. One of those names was Raymond Aldis Cross. I have reason to believe he relocated to Nevada. The reason I am writing is this. One of his earlier operations involved a blacksmith in Callaway County, named Callaway, who refused to cooperate with his land acquisition scheme and was subsequently killed. The investigating officer at the time suppressed the evidence. I do not know where Cross is now, but if you hear that name, take it seriously. Your friend G.A. Cole read the letter twice. He set it on the table. The woman in his house, the last mail-order bride no one wanted, was the daughter of the man named in this letter. She had not come here by any plan or intention. She had come because the Denver Marriage Bureau had run out of other options, and she had run out of other options, and the mechanism that moves people across continents had put her on a train to Nevada without either of them understanding what they were moving toward. Cole was wrong once. A blameless man had died because of his certainty. He would not act on incomplete information again. He needed to be certain before he put this weight on her. That was what he told himself, but sitting in the kitchen in the dark, listening to the quiet sounds of Nora settling in her room down the hall, the sounds of someone becoming slightly less a stranger in an unfamiliar house, Cole understood that his reasons for waiting were not entirely about protecting her. Some of it was about protecting himself from the particular kind of fear that comes when you have found something worth keeping, and you understand for the first time exactly how much you have to lose. He would tell her, soon, when he was certain. He was wrong once. He would not be wrong again. 3 weeks after Nora Callaway arrived at the Merritt Ranch, Cole found himself standing at the corner of the house watching her work in the neglected kitchen garden behind the back fence, and understanding, in the particular clear way of things you cannot unknow once you have understood them, that something had changed. The garden had gone through 2 seasons of abandonment, mostly weeds and hard-packed earth, with one surviving stand of heirloom tomatoes that had produced despite total neglect, the way some things do through sheer stubbornness and a refusal to acknowledge the odds. Nora had been reclaiming it for 4 days. She was on her knees in the dirt, hair loose from its pins, sleeves rolled to the elbow, engaged in a focused argument with a root system that did not want to be removed. She looked up when she heard Cole's boots on the dry ground and told him matter-of-factly that she was going to have root vegetables by November if it killed them both. He stood there longer than he meant to. He went back to the fence work he had been doing and spent the next hour being honest with himself about what that had been, which was not a thing he had expected to have to do when he wrote a letter to the Denver Marriage Bureau asking for someone who could cook, and was not afraid of hard work. That afternoon, they rode the north fence line together to check for wire breaks. The high Nevada light was flat and bright. 2 riders appeared on the ridge above the property line and stopped there, making no attempt at concealment, watching for 10 minutes before they turned and rode off. The stamp mill on the eastern ridge sent its low pulse through the afternoon air. Nora reached into her coat pocket without looking down. Her hand closed around something. She took a breath. Cole said they do that about once a week, counting the stock, estimating what I am worth. Nora said they are estimating whether you are worth removing. That is what they did with my father. They came by, counted his stock, walked the fence line. He thought they were being neighborly. They were calculating the cost of him. Cole held her gaze. He was close to telling her about the Aldous letter. The riders had stopped again on the ridge, and the feeling of being watched was its own kind of pressure. He said, "Stay close to the house for a few days." She said, "I am not hiding." He said, "I know. I am asking you to let me think before we move. Can you give me that?" She considered him with the careful measuring look she used when she was deciding how much trust to extend. She said, 2 days. Then I need to know what you know. He said 2 days. That evening, Cole went to the barn after supper and stood in the doorway watching Nora work with the wounded horse. The horse, Cross's men, had left at the gate post 3 weeks ago. She had been tending it every evening, talking to it in a low, steady voice. The kind of voice that communicates something through tone regardless of the words. The wound was healing cleanly. After a while, Cole said, "She's going to be all right." Nora did not turn around. She said, "I know." I could tell from the first night the wound was not meant to kill her. It was meant to be seen. Cole said you knew that from the first night. She said, I have seen wounds meant to kill and wounds meant to warn. There is a difference in how they are placed. A beat. Cole said, that is battlefield experience. She said yes. She ran her hand along the horse's flank. When she finally turned to face him, something had changed in the quality of the space between them. The particular shift that happens when two careful people decide, each in their own way and at roughly the same moment, to be slightly less careful. Cole said, come inside. I have something to tell you. He showed her the Aldous letter at the kitchen table. She read it standing up. She read it a second time. Then she set it down with the deliberateness of a person controlling something large with both hands, pressing it flat against the table as though the paper itself might fly away. She said, he is here. He has been here the whole time I have been here. Cole said yes. She said, did you know when you brought me to this ranch? He said no. The letter arrived 4 days after you did. She looked at him. She was checking, the way she checked everything, for the small tell that says a person is giving you an edited version of the truth. She found none. Cole Merritt was many things she was still working out, but a careful liar was not among them. His lies, such as they were the blunt, instrumental kind. This was not that. She said, all right. She picked up the letter again. Then we need to talk about what comes next. They were still talking when the sound of hoofbeats came up the ranch road in the early morning dark. Cross arrived alone, riding easy, smiling the way he smiled when he wanted people to understand that he had nothing to be concerned about, and never had. He claimed he was in the area checking fence lines with his land company's survey crew, just being neighborly. He spoke to Nora with the particular warm attention he reserved for people he was in the process of assessing. He mentioned, as if it had only just occurred to him, that he had known a family named Calloway once back in Missouri. Good people, he said. Such a shame what happened to that family. He looked directly at Nora when he said it. His expression did not change. Nora's expression did not change either. He rode away at the same unhurried pace he had arrived at. Cole watched him go. When he turned back, Nora was standing on the porch steps with her arms crossed, and she said in a voice as level as surveyed ground that Cross knew who she was. He had known since before she arrived. Cole said, I think so too. She said, then we are already behind. He said, yes, but we know it now. And knowing is the beginning of not being behind anymore. She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face, something that was not quite a smile but had the same quality as one, the internal version of the thing rather than the outward performance of it. She said, all right, Cole Merritt. Let us figure out what we know and what we can prove and what we're going to do about it. They went inside. The lamp burned late that night. Nora was not a woman who waited for permission. While Cole rode to the eastern ridge to survey the water tributaries above the contamination zone, she went into town alone. She had told him she was going to the general store, which was true. She was going to the general store and then to Cross's office, where she knew from Eleanor Marsh's inadvertent mention of the schedule that Cross's bookkeeper worked Tuesdays only, meaning the office would be empty by mid-afternoon. She bought flour, salt, and coffee at the general store. While she was paying, she asked Mrs. Aldrich behind the counter to send word to Eleanor Marsh that she had a question about the boarding house rates for a visiting cousin expected next month. This was not true, but it was the kind of social errand that required Eleanor to come to the store, which was what Nora needed. Eleanor arrived in 10 minutes. They stood near the bolt goods at the back of the store, away from the counter. Nora did not ask Eleanor what she knew. She said my father was James Calloway. He ran a blacksmith's forge in Callaway County, Missouri. He was killed 6 years ago by a man who wanted his land. I saw the man leaving. He wore a badge. No one investigated. Eleanor's hands were very still. Nora said, I am not looking for justice through proper channels. I stopped believing in proper channels a long time ago. I am looking for someone who was there and remembers what they saw. A long silence. The bolt goods smelled of new cotton and dust. Eleanor said, if I told you what I know and something happened to me afterward. Nora said, you have a daughter in Carson City and 3 grandchildren. She watched Eleanor go very still. She said, I heard you mention her last week. I am not threatening her, Mrs. Marsh. I am telling you I understand what you are protecting, and I am asking you to help me protect it a different way. By ending what could come for all of us if Cross keeps running this county the way he has been running it. Eleanor set down the spool of thread she had been holding and looked out the store window at Main Street. Then she said quietly and precisely what she had seen on the night James Calloway died. She had been traveling through Calloway County, staying at the inn adjacent to the forge. She had seen two men leave through the side door of the forge in the dark, moving fast. She had recognized one face clearly in the lamplight from the inn window. She had recognized that same face 3 years later when she arrived in Silver Creek to take over the boarding house property. Her late husband had left her and found it belonging to the most powerful man within 200 miles. She gave Nora what she had, a description, a date, a location. Harlan Cross, in Calloway County, Missouri, the night James Calloway died. Cross's office was on the second floor of the Consolidated Silver Building at the north end of Main Street, above the land company's public-facing rooms. The door to the staircase was unlocked. Cross was a man who relied on his reputation rather than locks, because in Silver Creek there was no one left who would dare go through his desk. The outer office was empty. The inner office door opened with a simple latch. Nora worked quickly and systematically. She found the geological surveys in the bottom left drawer. The real ones, not the versions shown to investors and county officials. These showed the deep vein of high-grade silver ore running precisely beneath the ranches Cross had been systematically acquiring over the past 3 years, including the Merritt property. She committed them to memory as completely as she could, page by page, the way a nurse memorizes dosages when there is no time to write things down. The bottom right drawer required a small blade to open. Inside, she found financial ledgers, deeds of transfer signed by ranchers who were now missing from the county, and a photograph. The photograph was old, 3 or 4 years at most, printed on cardstock, with a particular slight blurring of outdoor exposures in bright light. She recognized her father immediately. James Calloway, standing in front of his forge in Missouri summer light, squinting against the sun and almost smiling, in the way he smiled when he thought no one was watching, the private version of the smile that she had never been able to make herself forget. Standing beside him was a younger, slightly less weathered version of the man who yesterday had offered her minted candy from a crystal dish and asked with warm curiosity where she had grown up. Both men were looking at the camera. Both were grinning. On the back of the photograph, written in red ink in a hand she did not recognize, were 2 words, handled. Nora put the photograph in her coat pocket. She arranged the remaining contents of the drawer as she had found them. She latched the drawer with her blade. She walked out of Cross's office at the same pace she had walked in, down the stairs, across the land company's public room, and out the front door onto Main Street, which she crossed without hurrying. She made it to the alley behind the livery stable before her legs stopped working. She stood with her back against the livery wall for a long time. The stamp mill sent its pulse through the rock beneath her feet. A horse in the livery shifted and stamped. Somewhere on Main Street, a door opened and closed. She had found the bill of sale for a horse in the bottom drawer as well. The seller was listed as the Cross Estate of Missouri. The horse was described as a dark bay mare with a distinctive maker's mark on her left rear shoe, a cross inside a circle. The transaction date was 6 years ago, 3 months after her father's death. Cross had kept her father's horse. He had stabled it at his property outside Silver Creek for 6 years and then sent it to the Merritt ranch gate, not to warn Cole, but to warn her. To say, I knew who you were before you stepped off that train. I have always been 1 step ahead of you. She had taken the photograph. She should not have taken it. She could have left it and photographed its contents in her memory the way she had photographed the geological surveys. The photograph was irreplaceable, and Cross would know it was gone the moment he opened that drawer again. But the photograph was the only image left in the world of her father's face when he was smiling. She had not been able to leave it. She straightened up off the wall. She walked back to where she had tied her horse. She rode back to the Merritt Ranch through the late afternoon Nevada light, carrying the image of those 2 words in red ink on the back of her father's photograph, and she told herself what she had told herself 100 times in 6 years. This is not finished, and now I know where it is. The next morning, 2 of Cross's riders came through the Merritt Ranch's north pasture in broad daylight, walking their horses at a deliberate pace, not speaking to anyone, not stopping at the house, just riding through. The message required no words. Cross knew the photograph was gone. Cole was in the corral working with a young gelding when he saw them. He had the gelding's lead in his hand, and his jaw was tight. Nora came from the house and put her hand on the saddle of Cole's horse before he could think about mounting up. She said, "Don't. That is what he wants. You come at him directly and he responds with force and calls it self-defense." "I know this pattern." Cole said, "I know it too." He stood with his hand on the horse's neck. Then he looked at her. He said, "How did he find out so fast?" She told him about the photograph. All of it. The bottom drawer and the blade to open it, the bill of sale with the mare's description, the handwriting on the back of her father's picture. She told him she had taken it knowing it was a mistake and why she had taken it anyway. She did not minimize any part of it, and she did not apologize for the why. Cole listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "Nora." She said, "I know." He said, "I was going to say I would have done the same thing." She looked at him. He said, "Evidence matters. But some things you take because you need to, not because it is tactically correct." "I understand that." He paused. "We will manage the consequences of it." This was not forgiveness. It was recognition. It carried more weight. Ezra Dowd arrived an hour later, looking like a man who has reached the end of a rope and is trying to decide whether to tie a knot in it or let go entirely. He was 50, gray-haired, and had the particular stillness of exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness into something deeper. 4 more cattle dead this week, he told Cole, water from the lower creek making the remaining stock sick. The bank had declined a 3rd extension on his promissory note. Cross's land company had sent a buyer to his door this morning with a figure on a card. Cole offered Dowd access to the Merritt Spring. The Merritt well drew from an upstream source above the contamination zone, clean water, good water, enough to share. It was not a permanent solution, but it would buy Dowd time. Nora went into the house. She came back with a cloth bundle and placed it in Dowd's hands without ceremony. Dowd looked at it. He looked at Cole. "Nora said my father saved that money to rebuild after the mining company came through Missouri. He never got to use it. He would have wanted it used to keep the same thing from happening to someone else." Dowd's throat worked. He looked at the bundle. He looked at Nora. He said, "Ma'am, I cannot." She said, "Yes, you can. Take it, Ezra. Do not sign anything for the next 2 weeks. Just hold on." After Dowd had gone, Cole said, "That was your emergency money." She said, "Yes." He said, "If things go badly wrong, you will have nothing to fall back on." She said, "Then let us make sure things do not go badly wrong." He looked at her across the yard, in the flat Nevada morning light with the stamp mill pulsing in the distance and the mountains north still holding last winter's snow on the high peaks, and something in his expression changed in the way of things that change only once, and then stay changed. That evening, they sat on the porch after supper as the Nevada dark came in from the east. The stars came out sharp and close, the way they did at this elevation, bright enough to make the land below them look briefly lit from above. The stamp mill on the ridge had gone quiet for the night. The sound of the creek was clear in the stillness. Cole said, "When I was with the Pinkerton agency, I was certain of my own judgment." "That certainty cost a man everything," Nora said, "and you have been punishing yourself for it by trusting no one, including yourself." A pause. Cole said, "That is a direct way to put it." She said, "I have been punishing myself for trusting the wrong people by trusting no one at all." She was quiet for a moment. "We have matching problems." Another silence. Cole set down his coffee cup and reached across the space between them. He did not take her hand. He rested his hand beside hers on the porch rail, close enough that they were almost touching, giving her the choice to close the distance or leave it. She turned her hand over, their fingers interlinked. They sat like that for a long time without speaking. This was not a declaration. It was not a performance of anything. It was 2 people deciding quietly and without ceremony to stop being alone. The following morning, before first light, Cross came to the ranch alone. He waited on the kitchen side of the house until Cole had ridden out to the south fence, which told Nora that someone had been watching the ranch long enough to know Cole's morning routine. Cross spoke to her through the screen door with the pleasant manner of a man making a social call, which made everything he said somewhat worse. He told her he had known her father, that James Calloway had been a man he tried to help. He said her father's death was a tragedy, the result of a violent time in a violent place, men making desperate choices. These things happened. He said he thought she had come all this way carrying something heavy, and he would like to offer her a way to set it down. Take the deed for the Merritt Ranch at twice current market value and go back east. Start a life. Her father would not have wanted her to spend her years chasing something that was already done and gone. He paused. Then he said the alternative was that he would become curious about what had brought a woman from Missouri to Silver Creek. When he became curious, he tended to share that curiosity with people who had the means to investigate thoroughly, including the Denver Marriage Bureau, who might be very interested to know their last available bride had a history of making accusations against respected citizens in multiple states. He tipped his hat. He walked back to his horse. He rode away at an unhurried pace. Nora stood in the kitchen for a long time after he was gone. Then she picked up her father's pistol from the windowsill, checked the cylinder, and set it back down. She was not going anywhere. When Cole returned, she told him everything. The offer and the implied threat, and the fact that Cross had timed his visit for Cole's absence. Cole's expression during this account did something she had not seen it do before. It went very still, in the way of controlled feeling rather than absence of feeling. He was quiet for a long moment. He said he came here while I was gone. She said yes. He said he timed it. She said yes. Cole was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "This ends one way or another very soon. He is not going to wait much longer." She said, "I know. So we move first." The following evening, Deputy Wade Harmon arrived at the Merritt Ranch carrying an official document and an expression that belonged to a man delivering something he does not want to deliver. The document was a formal complaint filed with the county clerk, alleging that Cole Merritt had obtained Nora Calloway's contract of marriage by fraudulent representation of his property and financial standing. The complaint requested an immediate review of the arrangement and, pending that review, a requirement that Miss Calloway vacate the Merritt property and take up residence in supervised accommodation, which in Silver Creek meant the boarding house. The complaint bore a notary's seal. It bore a signature that appeared to be Nora's. It was not Nora's, though the forger had been careful. Anyone who had seen Nora write would recognize the difference. Anyone who had not would not know enough to question it. Wade said quietly that he was sorry. He said he had no choice but to deliver it. He said the review hearing was not scheduled for 5 days, which was the fastest he had been able to slow it down without being obvious about the slowing. After he left, Cole and Nora stood in the kitchen. Cole said if they were legally married before the review hearing, the complaint had no basis. A wife could not be removed from her husband's property on the complaint of herself. She said she understood the law. He said, "I want to be clear about something." He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of sentence easy. He started again. "I am not asking you to do this to solve a legal problem. I am asking because I would be asking regardless of the complaint. I would have been asking soon. The complaint just took the patience out of the timeline." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Ask me then." Cole said Nora Calloway. "Will you marry me?" It was not quite a question, more like a statement of intention offered in the form of a question out of courtesy. She said yes. Also not quite a question. Also not hesitant. Reverend Thomas Hale was 70 years old, largely deaf, and beholden to no one in Silver Creek because he had arrived with nothing and had acquired nothing beyond the church, which belonged to God and therefore to no one Cross could reach. He performed the ceremony in his kitchen the following afternoon with Eleanor Marsh and Ezra Dowd as witnesses. Nora wore the better of her 2 traveling dresses. Cole wore his cleanest shirt and had made an effort with his hair. When Reverend Hale reached the vows, Cole departed from the standard text without apology and without apparent self-consciousness, which Nora found she respected more than any romantic gesture she could have imagined beforehand. He said, "I promise to believe what you tell me. I promise not to make decisions about what you can handle. I promise to be wrong out loud when I am wrong, so you know the difference between that and when I am certain." Nora's eyes held his. She said the traditional vows first and then added one more. She said, "And I promise not to take things from locked drawers without telling you first." A small curve appeared at the corner of Cole Merritt's mouth. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, from something guarded into something that had been guarded for a long time and had finally decided it did not need to be. That evening there was no orchestrated romance and no particular staging of the moment. Cole brought 2 chairs out onto the porch, and they sat under the Nevada stars with the coffee they had been drinking all evening and talked about their fathers and about the war and about what they wanted this land to be. At some point, the talking became quieter. At some point, the quieter thing led them inside. What happened between them was honest and slightly uncertain and entirely genuine. The particular convergence of 2 people who had been careful for a long time, learning to be less careful with each other. It was earned by everything that had come before it. What Nora thought afterward, lying awake while Cole slept. This was the first time in years she had not felt the need to plan her escape from the place she was in. She was not entirely sure what to do with that. What Cole thought when he woke in the small hours and found her still there. That he had been afraid for a long time without knowing entirely what he was afraid of, and that some of that fear had quietly left the room. Before either of them was fully dressed the next morning, Eleanor Marsh knocked at the ranch door. She had walked the 2 miles from town in the pre-dawn dark, which told them everything about how urgent the matter was before she said a word. She sat at the kitchen table and told them she had been robbed in the night, not of money, not of valuables. Someone had come through the rear window of the boarding house while she slept and taken one thing. The journal she had kept during her travels in 1872, including her written account of what she had witnessed in Callaway County, Missouri, on the night James Callaway died. It was the only written record of what she had seen. It was gone. She said, "There is one more thing I should have told you sooner. The night James Callaway was killed, there were 2 men who left the forge. I recognized Cross. The second man I could not see clearly, but I saw his coat. It was a deputy's coat. I could see the badge by the lamplight from the inn window." Cole and Nora were both still. Eleanor said without looking at either of them that she was telling them this now because whoever had taken the journal had known exactly where it was, which meant someone she had spoken to about it had told them. The only person she had ever mentioned it to was Deputy Harmon, when he had helped her move some furniture the previous spring, and she had said something unguarded about keeping a record of everything she had seen in her traveling years. The kitchen was very quiet. Cole set down his coffee cup. Nora watched his face. She watched the careful dismantling of something happening behind his eyes, the slow adjustment of a man recalculating everything he had believed to be true about the last 3 years of his life. After Eleanor Marsh left, Cole went to the barn. Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched him. He stood among the horses with his head down and one hand on the fence rail, not moving. 10 minutes, 15, 20. The stamp mill on the eastern ridge sent its slow pulse through the morning air. She went to the barn doorway but did not go in. Inside, Cole was talking quietly to the horses, the way people talk to animals when they need to say something they cannot say to a person. She heard fragments of it. He had thought he knew Wade Harmon. 3 years. He had been wrong about Daniel Webb, wrong about trusting the informant who lied to him, and now wrong about the one man he had let himself trust since coming to Silver Creek. She heard him say she should have come here and found someone who... She stepped into the barn. Cole did not turn around. She crossed to stand beside him at the fence rail. They stood looking at the horses in the particular way of 2 people who are standing next to each other but in very different places. She said, "You want to know the worst thing about what happened with my father?" She did not wait for him to answer. I was right. I saw what I saw, and I was completely right, and it made absolutely no difference because I was alone. She paused. You were wrong once, and it cost someone everything. I was right once, and it cost me everything too. Being right alone is worth about as much as being wrong alone. Cole was quiet for a while. He said, I do not know if I can trust my own judgment anymore. She said, you read me right. A long pause. He said, yes. She said, then trust that, and keep going. He turned to look at her. Something in his face had settled, not resolved, not finished with the weight of it, but settled, the way a building settles onto its foundation, still standing, resting differently than it was before. They spent the rest of the day working through what they knew, the geological surveys Nora had committed to memory, Eleanor's testimony, which was still valid as a spoken account even without the written journal, the Aldous letter, the bill of sale for the mare, the deeds of transfer they could document, the water contamination they could demonstrate through samples taken from the lower creek. The pattern was there. It was provable. But to prove it, they needed a territorial judge, not a county one, because every county official in Silver Creek either owed Cross a favor or was afraid of him. They needed someone outside the county system entirely. They needed someone who could bring a warrant from above the level that Cross controlled. Late that night, after supper, after they'd gone over the plan 3 times and found it as sound as it was going to get, a knock came at the rear kitchen door, the cautious knock of someone who did not want to be seen approaching. Cole opened the door with his hand on his revolver. The man standing in the dark was thin and bearded, wearing clothes that had been slept in for weeks. He was somewhere around 40, or had been worn by circumstance to look it, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent a long time in places where sudden movements attracted the wrong kind of attention. Cole went completely still. The man said, I am not here for an argument, Merritt. I came because you are apparently the only other person in this part of Nevada who wants Cross badly enough to actually do something about him. Daniel Webb had not hanged. His execution had been stayed 46 hours before the scheduled date by a clerical error at the Carson City Court, a misfiled document that accidentally created grounds for a procedural appeal. He had spent 2 years and 4 months in the Nevada State Prison at Carson City, while the appeal moved through the territorial courts. He had been released when a different Pinkerton investigator working a separate land fraud case uncovered the fabricated evidence that had convicted him. He had a letter of exoneration from the territorial governor's office. He had spent the 14 months since then following Cross across Nevada, living rough and staying quiet, one step behind a man who had no idea he was being followed. He had been in Silver Creek for 3 weeks, watching from the hills outside town. What Webb had that Cole and Nora did not was direct eyewitness testimony of Cross's operation in Missouri in the early years, before the Calloway murder, when Webb had been working as a surveyor adjacent to Cross's scheme before he understood what he was part of. Names, dates, locations. The memory of a man who had had nothing to do for 14 months, but remember. Cole and Daniel Webb sat across the kitchen table from each other. Nora stood in the doorway. Cole said, I am sorry. Webb said, I know. Cole said, I was certain. I had no reason to doubt my source. Webb said, I know that too. A pause. Webb said, I did not come here for an apology, Merritt. You made a mistake that nearly killed me, and I spent more time than I care to admit being angry about it. But Cross is the one who built the lie. He is the one I want. Cole said, what do you need from me? Webb said someone the territorial judge will actually listen to. A former Pinkerton man carries weight I do not have on my own. Nora said, what about a woman whose father Cross had killed in Calloway County? Webb looked at her for the first time. He said, you are James Calloway's daughter. She said, yes. Webb was quiet for a moment. He said, your father was a good man. He tried to warn me what was happening in that county before everything fell apart. I did not listen to him. The 3 of them looked at each other across the kitchen table. 3 people who had been wrong or right or both, in ways that had cost them everything. Cross was still out there, and it was very late, and what needed to happen had to happen in the next 2 days. They made a plan. Before first light, Daniel Webb rode south toward Carson City. He carried a written deposition from Cole, laying out the full account of the fabricated evidence and its connection to Cross, a written statement from Eleanor Marsh with her eyewitness account of Callaway County in 1872, and the geological surveys that Nora had reconstructed from memory on 6 sheets of paper the previous evening, drawn with the precision of someone who had spent years reading her father's geological texts and knew exactly what she was rendering. They were not originals. They were accurate enough for a territorial judge to subpoena the originals. Webb would seek an emergency hearing before Territorial Judge Harold Foss in Carson City, a man Cole knew from a previous case and who was not connected to Cross's operation. Nora rode to the neighboring ranches in the early morning dark. She delivered one message to Dowd and 2 other ranchers. Do not sign anything for 2 days. Hold on. If you can hold on for 2 days, this ends. Cole stayed in Silver Creek to keep Cross's attention on the wrong direction. Before Nora rode, she came to Cole at the barn. The morning was cold and clear, the Nevada high desert cold that makes the stars look close enough to touch. She straightened the collar of his coat, a small domestic gesture, the most intimate thing they had done in daylight. He caught her hand. He said, "Come back." She said, "I will." She looked at him. Then she said, "I love you." "I did not come here expecting to, but there it is." He said, "Nora." She said, "You do not have to say it back. I just wanted you to know before we did something dangerous." He said, "I have loved you since about the 3rd day you were here, when you told me you were going to have root vegetables by November if it killed us both." She looked at him. He said, "I was waiting until the timing was better." She said, "The timing is never going to be better than right now." He kissed her once, not urgent, not performed for any audience, the kind of kiss that has a future attached to it. Then she rode. Cole went to the sheriff's office to find Cal Briggs and encountered Wade Harmon instead. Wade was standing in the doorway of the jail with a rifle, and he had the look of a man who had been up all night rehearsing a decision and still was not sure he had made the right one. Wade said, "Cross knows about the deposition. He knows Webb is riding south." Cole said, "How?" Wade said after a moment, "Because I told him." The stamp mill on the ridge sent its pulse through the silence. A dog barked somewhere on the cross street and then stopped. Cole said, "You followed me this morning." Wade said, "Cole, I..." He stopped. He started again. 4 years ago, I had a wife with a difficult delivery and $300 in medical debts I could not cover on a deputy's wage. Cross paid it. He said it would not amount to much, just keeping him informed of things he should know. And then it got bigger, and I was too far into it to find my way back out. Cole said you were at the Callaway Forge. Wade closed his eyes. He said I was outside. I did not know what Cross was going to do. I thought we were there to threaten the man into signing. When I heard the shot, I ran. He stopped. God help me, I ran. Cole stood very still. Cole Merritt had been wrong about Daniel Webb because he trusted the wrong man. He had come to Silver Creek and built a life and found someone to trust again. And that person was standing in front of him now with a rifle and a face full of the particular anguish of a man who has carried something terrible for so long that setting it down feels worse than continuing to carry it. Cross did not just corrupt people. Cross found the good things in a person's life and used them as the mechanism of corruption. He had found Wade's love for his son and his desperation to protect his family, and had turned those things into a lever. Cole said, "Put the rifle down, Wade." Wade did not move. His hands were shaking. Cole said, "I am not going to ask you twice, but I am going to tell you something first." He waited until Wade was looking at him. He said, "That boy of yours is 7 years old. I have seen how you talk about him. He thinks you're a decent man. You put that rifle down and go into that jail and tell the territorial marshal everything you know, and your boy will still have a father. Maybe not home for a while, but a father who made the harder choice when it counted. That matters to a boy more than you think." "If I put it down, I go to jail," Wade said. Cole said yes. 30 seconds of complete stillness. The morning light was coming up behind the eastern ridge, behind the stamp mill, The mill had not started its day cycle yet. Silver Creek was very quiet. The rifle came down, slowly, like something very heavy being released. Wade sat down on the jailhouse step and put his face in his hands. Cole said, "I will tell the judge you cooperated. Everything you give them makes it better for you. But it starts now. Where is Cross going, and what has he told his men to do?" Wade raised his head, and he started talking. Cross was at his office preparing to leave. Not fleeing openly. The controlled departure of a man who had done this before, in other towns under other names. Documents going into the fireplace. 2 horses saddled in the alley behind the building. Cole walked in through the front door. Cross turned from the fireplace. For a moment, both of them were completely still. Cross said, "You understand, you have nothing. Whatever you think you have assembled." Cole said, "Daniel Webb is in Carson City." Cross said nothing. Cole said he has Eleanor Marsh's sworn account of Callaway County, Missouri, 1872. He has the geological surveys. He has the financial ledgers or a reconstruction of them accurate enough for a territorial judge to subpoena the originals. He has his own testimony about your Missouri operation going back to 1871. Webb has no credibility, Cross said. A convicted man. Cole said, exonerated. 3 years ago, by the territorial governor's office. He let that sit for a moment. You did not know that. Something changed in Cross's face. A calculation that had been running on false assumptions, suddenly arriving at a wrong answer. Cole said, "You have been running from something that was already resolved. You have been spending the last 3 years destroying ranches and poisoning water and threatening people to protect a secret that was already halfway out into the open." Cross looked at the fireplace. He looked at the back door. He looked at the window where 2 silhouettes were visible in the morning light. Ezra Dowd and another rancher standing still, watching. Cross said, "There are a dozen men in this county who will testify that I am a legitimate businessman." Cole said, "There are a dozen men in this county who took your money and will say what you paid them to say. That is not the same thing as legitimate, and a territorial judge knows the difference." Cole took 1 step forward. His hand was not on his revolver. This was deliberate. The absence of the gesture carried more weight than the gesture would have. He said, "Harlan, those people standing outside this building right now, the ranchers and the merchants and the families whose water you poisoned and whose cattle you killed and whose livelihoods you spent 3 years dismantling, they are not going to let you ride out of Silver Creek today. You can come with me to the sheriff's office and wait for the territorial marshal, or you can try to walk out that back door and see what happens. I would recommend the first." Cross looked at the window. He looked at Cole. He sat down. He said, "Get your judge." Daniel Webb returned from Carson City 2 days later with Territorial Marshal James Corder and a warrant for the arrest of Raymond Aldous Cross, also known as Harlan Cross, on charges including conspiracy to commit murder in Callaway County, Missouri, fraudulent land acquisition in the Nevada Territory, and deliberate contamination of water sources with intent to cause property damage and the destruction of livestock. Cross was held in the Silver Creek County Jail under county authority, waiting for transfer to the territorial court at Carson City for arraignment and trial. Wade Harmon was taken into county custody separately. His cooperation was noted formally in the marshal's report. The charges against him were reduced to accessory after the fact and conspiracy to suppress evidence. He would face sentencing in the Nevada District Court. The judge's recommendation, which came several weeks later, was 3 years in the Nevada State Prison at Carson City, with the possibility of early release for good conduct, and in recognition of his full cooperation with the territorial investigation. Nora stood in the street and watched the marshal's wagon carry Cross out of Silver Creek. She had ridden through the morning to get back to town in time, pushing the mare hard on the ridge road, arriving with her hair blown loose and dust on her face. She stood on the boardwalk outside the general store and watched the wagon pass. Cole stood beside her. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. After the wagon rounded the bend at the south end of Main Street and disappeared, Nora stood for a moment longer. Then she reached up and pressed her thumb and forefinger against the bridge of her nose and took a long, slow breath. She said, "Well?" Cole said, "Well?" She almost laughed. It came out as something quieter than a laugh, something more private. They sat with Daniel Webb on Eleanor Marsh's porch that afternoon, the four of them, with coffee that Eleanor made and the particular Nevada autumn light coming in low and gold over the ridge. Webb told Nora about the last conversation he had with her father, the week before James Calloway died. He had come to the forge to have a horse shod. Her father had been working at the anvil, and Webb had mentioned that he was worried about what the mining consortium was doing in the county, the pressure they were putting on people, the rumors about what happened to those who refused. James Calloway had kept working while he talked, the way a blacksmith works, steady and rhythmic. He had said a man's land is what he leaves behind. I am not leaving behind a piece of paper that says Raymond Cross owned what my father built. Nora was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "Thank you for coming to Silver Creek." Webb said I owed you. Your father, anyway. She said you do not owe me anything. But I am glad you are here. He left the next morning. He had a daughter in Illinois he had not seen in 2 years, and he said it was time to stop following things and start building them. Nora shook his hand on the boarding house porch and watched him ride south. Cole went to the jail the morning Wade was transported to Carson City. He did not say much. He brought a letter he had written to the district court judge, laying out the facts of Wade's character and the specifics of his cooperation, the kind of letter that does not argue for an outcome, but gives a judge information they should have. He left it with the county clerk. Wade, through the cell bars, said you did not have to do that. Cole said no. Wade said, "I nearly shot you." Cole said, "I know." A pause. Wade said, "Will you look in on my boy?" Not regular. I am not asking that. Just occasionally. Cole said yes. He meant it. He would. Eleanor came to the ranch 2 days later with a jar of preserved peaches. She set it on the kitchen table and told Nora that she had intercepted it from the kitchen shelf where Cross had left it on Nora's second day in Silver Creek, and had sent it to be tested by the assay office chemist. The chemist had found arsenic in it. A small amount, not lethal in a single serving, consistent with Cross's method of gradual contamination. Cross had identified Nora as a threat before she arrived in Silver Creek, and he had been planning to address her the same way he had addressed the water supply. Nora looked at the jar. Eleanor said he knew exactly what he was doing from the day you stepped off that train. Nora said then he underestimated what I was doing. Eleanor looked at her with the expression of a woman who has carried something too long and has finally set it down on a solid surface. She said your father would be proud of you. Nora said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. I think he always was. I just needed to stop moving long enough to feel it. Cole wrote 2 letters that evening at the kitchen table. The first was to the Pinkerton Agency, closing the Daniel Webb file and requesting that his full written account of Cross's fabricated evidence be placed in Webb's exoneration record alongside the existing governor's letter. The second was short, to George Aldis. It said, "You were right about Cross. It is handled. Thank you." Merritt. He sealed both envelopes and set them on the table. Outside, Nora was working in the garden in the last of the afternoon light, talking to herself in the low voice she used when she was thinking something through. He could hear it through the window, not the words, just the sound of it. He sat for a moment listening, then he went out to help her. 1 month after the marshal's wagon left Silver Creek, the Nevada Territory Geological Survey confirmed the water contamination in the lower creek tributaries and ordered remediation. 2 deeds of transfer belonging to Cross's land company were voided by the territorial court, and the properties were returned to their original owners. Ezra Dowd got his cattle back in order by November. The stamp mill on the eastern ridge went into receivership pending an audit of its ownership structure. Silver Creek began the slow, particular process of a community adjusting to the absence of the thing that had been making it afraid for 3 years. It looked like nothing dramatic from the outside. People came back to the public well. The ranchers who had been speaking in low voices in corners of the general store started speaking at normal volume again. It was not celebrated. It was just quietly, gradually, different. The horse Nora had named Missouri was fully healed by October. She ran with the other horses in the corrals with an easy, long-legged stride that made Cole's geldings look like they were trying too hard. Nora kept one of her horseshoes on a nail inside the barn door, the left rear shoe, with the maker's mark. A small cross inside a circle, stamped clean into the iron by James Calloway's hand, still marking something after everything that had been done to remove it from the world. Cole spent an evening in the barn in late October with a wood-burning tool and a pine plank he had been curing since early in the month. Nora was asleep. He worked by lantern light, burning the letters in carefully, making them straight and deep. She found it in the morning, the new sign above the ranch gate, Merritt and Calloway. She stood looking at it for a long time without speaking. Cole stood beside her with his coffee waiting. She said, "You did not ask me." He said no. She said, "Do you want to change it?" He said, "Do you want me to?" She was quiet for a moment, then she put her hand in his. Not the careful, deliberate gesture of a woman making a decision, the automatic reach of someone who had stopped thinking about it, which was the only kind that counted. She said Calloway was my father's name. It should be on something that lasts. Cole looked up at the sign. Behind them in the house, the life they were building was already underway. He said it will. The Nevada autumn light came in long and gold over the ridge. Missouri grazed in the near pasture, her dark coat smooth, moving easy in the morning cool. The mountains north still held their high snow. The stamp mill had not started its morning cycle yet, and the air was very clear, with the particular clarity of high desert October, the kind of air that makes everything look like it was made this morning and is still deciding what it is going to be. Cole and Nora stood at their gate in that light, in that air, with the sign above them that held both their names, and the land around them that they were going to work together for as long as the land lasted. There was nothing that needed saying. There is, sometimes, nothing that needs saying. That is when you know you are home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.